All right, so let's bring in Washington Post national political correspondent James Hohmann. All right, so that was a pretty interesting speech, Q&A session that he had earlier this morning in Poland. So, James, on the one hand, he's actually calling Russia's behavior destabilizing, at least in that region. And then on the other hand, he's like dancing around the question about whether or not Russia interfered in our election in 2016. What do you make of this?
Yeah, Anne-Marie and Stephanie, it's the difference between teleprompter Trump and Twitter Trump. There's the Trump that destabilizing soundbite we heard clearly was written by national security experts, that went through a committee, went through a lot of drafts. It was read off of a teleprompter, very carefully scripted. And then Trump in a press conference or on Twitter is letting it rip. That's not the sanctioned talking point. That's not what his aides want him to say. They would love for him to just say, yes, it was Russia, and move on. But Trump can't help it because he thinks that if he acknowledges Russia interfered in the election, that he is somehow undercutting his legitimacy as president. Whether that's right or wrong, that's how he perceives it, and that's why he's so sensitive every time he's asked. That's how you kind of hear him twist himself sort of into a pretzel where he says, we don't know if it was Russia, but Obama did know it was Russia and he didn't do anything about it, which doesn't really make sense when you put those two points side by side. But it reflects just the incredible sensitivity, and that's the real Trump. That's, the onion peeled back. That's where he's really at. So there's what his aides want him to say and get him to say at a podium, and then there's what he says when he, doesn't have notes to go off of.
Yeah, and James, it has the ultimate effect of diluting any direct criticism at Russia, which is what critics of President Trump and his policy toward Russia, his overtures toward Russia, have been wanting to see. What does it indicate to you about how the president plans to handle that high-stakes meeting with President Putin tomorrow?
That's such an important point, and it's so true. When Trump is reading off of a teleprompter, a carefully scripted line, sort of criticizing Russia, you actually heard Polish people in the crowd cheer pretty loudly when he did that. But the Russians don't actually worry about it. They're not, scared about their incursion into Ukraine because they know Trump doesn't really feel strongly about these issues. What White House officials continue to tell us, including at briefings this morning, is that Trump still doesn't really have a firm agenda for his meeting with Putin. It's supposed to be sort of a get-to-know-you session, that he doesn't have any asks. There are reports that he's asked for a list of potential concessions he could make to the Russians, and it's not clear just how seriously Trump is preparing for this meeting, which is going to be a real bilateral meeting. Originally, there were sort of suggestions from the White House that this was going to be sort of a pull aside, a quick kind of chat, grip and grin, maybe get a 2 minutes of chit chat in. But this is going to be a formal bilateral meeting, the first time that an American president and a Russian leader have met this way in 2 years. Obama last year at this G20 summit kind of did a very brief chat with Putin where he criticized him for this election meddling and warned him to cut it off, or said there would be consequences, and wouldn't give him a kind of a traditional formal sit-down meeting.
So the president also spoke earlier about North Korea and sort of gave us a little window into what could be a strategy towards North Korea. Let's listen to that.
As far as North Korea is concerned, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I don't like to talk about what I have planned, but I have some pretty severe things that we're thinking about. That doesn't mean we're going to do them.
All right, so we didn't get much there at all, and he said, he's not going to put down or place a red line down, and much like his response before, he then pivoted to Barack Obama and the red line, which is a whole other thing in Syria. But, you've been doing a lot of reporting on the president's evolving North Korea strategy, and you've at one point even called him naive. What do you make of this response?
Yeah, I think Trump is trying to preserve his options, but frankly, there are no good options here. And there's bipartisan consensus. There's no easy solution. We tried leaning on the Chinese to get the North Koreans to cut it out. That's hard. The Chinese are sort of playing a long game. Trump, has sort of used saber rattling and tried to kind of scare the North Koreans into coming to the negotiating table, as we just heard, maybe making them think we might strike them. But the North Koreans, I don't think, take that threat seriously because they know that we're very scared of going to war with North Korea. Back in April, when Vice President Pence went to the demilitarized zone, he said if North Korea did another missile test, there would be very severe consequences. And here they've done a couple now, and there haven't really been severe consequences. So I think we have to be careful with some of this rhetoric, because it rings a little hollow when every time there's a missile launch, you say, we're looking at doing something very serious, and then you don't do anything. And that is ultimately how Barack Obama fell into the trap of drawing the red line on Syria, is when you kind of start making these ominous sounding threats, eventually you have to follow through for your words to mean anything. And the truth is, we're just not in a position where we want to go to war with North Korea right now.
It'll be interesting to see whether President Xi and Trump have any sort of sideline meeting out of this G20. Before I let you go, James, I want to sort of switch gears. You did some important reporting today about the White House's panel on voter fraud, and specifically about the Republican lawmakers around the country who are refusing the president's request for voter information. So walk us through what you found out.
Yeah, so last week, the voter fraud commission that President Trump created sent this request out to every Secretary of State, basically saying, send us all of your voter information. We want to put it into one central database so we can see, we can check it against immigration databases, Social Security databases, look for potential fraud. And now 44 states have said that they're not going to fully comply with this request. Some are not cooperating at all, saying we're not going to send you anything. Some are saying we're not going to send you our voter Social Security numbers. Others are kind of exploring what they can and can't send. But what has been most interesting, and the reason that it's kind of been so surprising over the last week, is some of the biggest critics aren't Democrats, but very conservative people who fought the Obama Justice Department when they tried to get some of the same information. And they're trying to say, we're being ideologically consistent. We wouldn't give this to Obama. We're not going to give it to Trump either. That includes really conservative red states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, Idaho, places like that, even Arizona, which was a little bit closer in the presidential election. And in the case of Mississippi, one of the states Trump carried by a bigger margin than anywhere else, the Republican Secretary of State actually said Trump's voter commission can go jump into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not going to give them anything. So it's sort of interesting, because these guys are actually following through on all their talk about federalism and states' rights. This isn't just something that they said during the Obama years. They're showing they really meant it. And now it leaves this White House commission in a tough spot, because if they don't get some of this information, they can't really do the work that they've been created to do. The White House sort of on the defensive, President Trump criticizing the election officials who wouldn't turn over data. But again, these are very, very conservative Republicans. It's not sort of a traditional Trump versus Democratic situation.
Jump into the Gulf of Mexico. Tell us how you really feel. James Hohmann of the Washington Post, thank you so much.
Thank you.